This is Dennis Bartok. I'm the film programmer for the American Cinematheque, and I'd like to welcome you, Billy, to do the audio commentary for The Guardian. I'd like to thank you for taking time out from post-production on your new film, The Rules of Engagement.
Good to talk to you, Dennis, as always. I haven't seen this film for a number of years, so it'll be interesting to try and do a comment on it while it's going.
You directed one of the seminal, many people think the definitive American horror film, in 1973 with The Exorcist, and you were approached afterwards to do a number of horror, supernatural-related projects, including the sequels to The Exorcist, and you turned all of those down. What made you decide to return to the horror genre over 10 years after The Exorcist?
Dennis, as you know, I've never really thought of The Exorcist in terms of a horror film. I've always thought of The Exorcist as a story about the mystery of faith. It was based on actual events, and I tried to follow those events, as Blatty did in his novel, rather faithfully. And so I was never interested per se in directing, let's say, horror films or working in that genre. When The Guardian came along, it came to me from a producer by the name of Joe Wazan, who was originally my agent when I first came to Hollywood. And he came to me with a script that I really didn't think was very good at all or very interesting. But what I saw in it, the thing that attracted me to it, was I thought I could do something like a modern-day version of a grim fairy tale, set in contemporary setting and involving ordinary people caught up in the kind of things that characters in Grimm's fairy tales were usually caught up in, like Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf. And that was what really piqued my interest in it. Children at risk, a father and a mother fighting to protect the child against sort of supernatural forces. So I felt it was very much different from The Exorcist, which I never, as I say, considered a pure horror film. The Guardian is sort of an attempt at that, at doing much more of something like a pure horror film. And so I really didn't feel that in that sense it was returning to something like The Exorcist.
Well, in some ways it's almost a kind of flip side, because The Exorcist was about Catholic belief. It was about the sort of traditional battle of good versus evil, the church versus the devil. The Guardian is about almost pre-Christian mythology, pagan mythology, tree spirits, druidic spirits. Was that on your mind at all?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the whole idea of timeless evil spirits alive and present in the world today in a contemporary suburb was what really attracted me to this. Usually these stories are done in some kind of period. These myths are alive and with us, and it occurred to me that the way to present this was in a totally contemporary way, but having to do with, as you say, druids and evil spirits that are actually present, that are there, that are not mythological. The thing that makes the myths live, I believe, for a modern audience is to place them in a contemporary context. And that was an interesting challenge to me. You know, to what extent I was able to bring it off, I will never know, and I'm not sure, and it's really left to the viewer. But that was the attempt.
Well, you mentioned something very interesting there about putting classic myths in a contemporary setting, because almost all of your films are set in the modern day. You've done a few period pieces like The Brink's Job or like The Night They Raided Minsky's, but most of your films are really contemporary. They're very modern. Is that something you feel much more comfortable working in, a modern setting?
Yes, certainly. But I've never seen a film that was set in the past that I wish I had done. There've been some great ones, but I've never thought, wow, I wish I had done that. Braveheart or whatever the hell it is that deals with sort of historical stories or situations. I'm always much more attracted to things that take place in the contemporary world. I'm much more familiar on that terrain, even though most of the reading I do is about the past. I'm especially fascinated, in reading about things like Nazi Germany, but because that is, and I read almost everything that comes out about Nazi Germany, because the real theme that interests me and attracts me is what is it that gets into otherwise decent people, or for example, an entire race of people, that causes them to do bad or evil things. That really is a constant theme of mine. That and the thin line between good and evil that exists in all of us. There's goodness in everyone and there's evil in everyone, and it's sometimes hard to predict when these things are going to manifest themselves.
Well, I think you mentioned that before in one of our earlier conversations, that you felt that one of the only examples of satanic or demonic possession in the modern age was Nazi Germany during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I feel that is demonic possession on a massive scale. And nothing else explains that to me satisfactorily. What happened? There are all sorts of explanations involving the social conditions in Germany between or after World War I, the resentment against Jewish bankers, and what the German people perceived to be a conspiracy on the part of the Jews to control Germany. There are all sorts of explanations as to why that exploded in the way that it did, but nothing seems as acceptable to me as the notion of demonic possession on a mass scale.
Begin another.
I wanted to talk a bit about the casting for The Guardian. Jenny Seagrove, who plays the nanny, the lead character, is probably best known for playing the kind of bewitching mermaid in Local Hero. Were you familiar with her earlier films, and how did you cast Jenny Seagrove in the lead?
I had seen her on stage in London, in some doing some marvelous work, and of course I saw Local Hero, and I liked her very much. I wanted a cast of people that were unfamiliar to audiences. I've always tried to do that. When The French Connection was cast, Gene Hackman was not familiar as a leading actor, and in The Exorcist there were no real major stars in The Exorcist. I mean, there were wonderful actors, and I've always tried, whenever possible, to just cast the film based on people whose work I like, whether or not they happen to be stars. I haven't always done that, but it is something, that I like to do. This fellow Dwyer Brown, who appears in The Guardian, is a fellow who had a very small part in To Live and Die in L.A., and I always thought he had tremendous potential as a young leading man. And then he had a very important role in Field of Dreams.
Right, he played, I think, Kevin Costner's dad.
That's right. He was Kevin Costner's father. And I liked him from having worked with him in To Live and Die in L.A., and he went on to do some really interesting work after that. And so I always thought, someday if I had a chance to put him in a featured role, I would. So that's how he got into it. Carrie Lowell just came in and auditioned. When I first met her, I thought she was just one of the most spectacularly beautiful women I'd ever seen, with a wonderful nature and tremendous sensitivity and knowledge. I mean, she was a very famous model, but clearly not just a pretty face. She's a highly intelligent and involved young woman, and I was amazed that by now doesn't have a really big career as an actress, because she is very beautiful and very talented.
We know anyway. We think people are gonna pop in from Chicago.
I don't know. You never know. Somebody might arrive unexpectedly.
Any relatives?
Yeah, a relative, you could say. Really not to visit, maybe permanently.
Your mother?
No, not my mother. Smaller than my mother, smaller.
Smaller than your mother. A rat. A mouse, an ant, a germ.
Now, what was the rehearsal process like on The Guardian? How much do you usually work with actors beforehand?
What I'll do is usually talk to the actors before we do a scene. I'll talk to them initially when I cast them about what the film is trying to accomplish, what it is in my mind. I'll get their ideas and their thoughts, but then I don't like to do a lot of rehearsal. The only film that I rehearsed to any great extent was The Exorcist. I rehearsed it for 3 weeks, and believe me, the performances in those 3 weeks of rehearsal are better than anything I ever filmed. The actors had it to the point where they could have put it on stage. And when we came to film it, a lot of it, in my opinion, was left in the locker room. It was never as good as the rehearsals. So I just didn't want to repeat that process. What I'll do is before a scene, I'll rehearse extensively right before shooting until the actors seem to be ready to do it. And then I'll let them do it and usually print the first or second take. Because what I'm interested in more than a well-rehearsed scene is spontaneity. I'm interested in little mistakes and idiosyncratic behavior that generally I find rehearsal robs a scene of those qualities.
Well, it reminds me of a great quote from Bertolucci where he said whenever he shoots a film, he always leaves a door open on the set. He doesn't mean literally, but what he means is he always leaves room for something surprising to happen, something that he didn't expect. Is that, in some ways, your approach to filmmaking?
That's what I'm going for at all times, is spontaneity and something that doesn't feel rehearsed, doesn't feel acted. I'm not always successful at getting that, but that's what I intend, with every film that I make. The most interesting ingredient to me is spontaneity, idiosyncratic behavior, because usually I'm casting people for qualities that I see in the actors themselves. I don't ever remember going to an actor or an actress and trying to get them to do something or play someone that is not within their realm of experience. I usually cast them because I feel that they bring to this role something that I see in them that's right for the role.
Now, you've mentioned Dario Argento as one of your favorite filmmakers, and in a lot of ways, The Guardian seems closest to Argento films like Deep Red about the traumas of childhood, or Phenomenon about nature gone awry. Can you talk a little bit about why you like Argento's work so much?
I like Argento's work, and I don't feel anything I've ever done has even gotten close to it because of its visceral nature, and it's just fun and entertaining. I tend to have a much more serious side. So The Guardian does not play as a lot of fun. Any Argento horror film is just a lot of fun to watch and very entertaining, and he doesn't worry about making sense out of anything. What happens on the screen in an Argento film is stuff that defies sense. And what I tried to do with a film like The Guardian is underpin the reality of something that is basically not real. I try to give it a realistic foundation, and it is void of all the kind of camera tricks and heavy sound recording and artificial spook effects of an Argento film, although I love those pictures. Not all of them. I mean, I think, some of them go way over the top. But the ones that are good that Argento has done, as I say, they're not influential to me. They're just marvelously enjoyable because they are so unexpected and so far out. The work of Argento's that I like are the ones where there is at least some kind of link to reality. In the later years, Argento, I think, completely abandoned any sense of reality. But the stuff is still a lot of fun to watch.
Well, what you're saying about underpinning the horror with a sense of realism brings to mind another film which has caused a sensation recently, which is the Blair Witch Project, which seems to me to be really using the formula from a film like The Exorcist, where it's the realism that creates the terror. It's not the spook effects.
That's probably the only thing that the Blair Witch Project has in common with The Exorcist. The Blair Witch Project is a totally original film that, for me, works on every level. And what it does, and where it succeeds for me, where many other horror films do not succeed, is that it uses the imagination of the audience better than any film in that genre that I've seen. You see nothing. It shows you nothing. It leaves everything to the imagination. And I think that's a major factor of why people appreciate it, because they're not only allowed to, but they're forced to bring their imaginations into the mix. And that is reminiscent to me of what it used to be like to listen to dramatic radio in the early days of radio, the 1940s, when I was a kid growing up, and there was no television. When I was 5, 6, 7 years old, we would listen to radio shows that were absolutely terrifying, some of them. And the Blair Witch Project is almost a radio show. You know, very often the screen goes black, you don't see anything, you just hear voices. Sometimes the camera is set down on the ground and you can't even see the actors. You see legs and ankles and a distant view of them while the camera's set down. I think it's a totally original vision, and it's something that I wish I had strived more to achieve that sort of thing in some of the films that I've made. The secret ingredient that is out there that filmmakers don't take advantage of is the audience's imagination, especially now with computer-generated effects where you can show everything. So they can show everything today, and they do. To some extent, I tried to use the imagination in The Guardian, to a great extent. If I were doing it again today, I might try to call more on the audience's imagination. Because I think that, as I say, is the hidden ingredient of horror films that has been lost over the last 50 years or so. The audience now sees everything, and they're not even called upon to think about what they see. It's all spelled out for them. It's all right there. And it's much better to let the audience find a film and to think about it as they will.
Well, imagination is something that the great horror masters like Val Lewton used, Jacques Tourneau in Curse of the Demon in the 1950s. The sense of what is not shown is much more terrifying than what is shown.
I think so. Again, as I say, the most powerful quality that you could bring to a horror film is the audience's imagination, because things are far worse there than anything you could show. Once the seeds are planted for something strange and unusual to happen.
Call me Camilla.
Now, you talked in the press notes about The Guardian that you were inspired on some level about what you described as devastating personal experiences that you had had with people watching your children, nannies, caretakers. Could you talk a little bit about your own personal anxieties as a father and how that worked into The Guardian?
Strangely, The Guardian is probably the most personal film I've ever made, because when I was married, I had a very young child at the time, and because I was working and his mother was working, we were often away. But like for the first 9 or 10 months of my son's life, we didn't go away. We stayed with him constantly. But his mother and I knew nothing about parenting, so we had, professionals come in and help us from time to time. We had a young girl from England come in that we interviewed while we were in England. This young woman lived in Bath, which is a historical but very small suburb of London. This young girl that we met, she was 19 years old. She had never been out of Bath, England. She came from the same agency that Princess Diana was registered with. And so she came highly recommended by the top nanny agency in England. And we hired her and brought her back to the United States. And after 9 or 10 months, now this girl did not drive a car, and to our knowledge, she had no friends in Los Angeles. After about 10 months, his mother and I went out of town for a weekend. We went for a weekend to San Francisco. When we got back, she was very upset. She was nervous. She was sort of really coming apart, this otherwise placid, docile young woman. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she was forced to confess to me that her passport was gone and all of her money. And it turned out, under further questioning, that when my son's mother and I, when we left for that weekend, this girl had made a girlfriend. She had a girlfriend. Somehow or other, she had a friend there. This girlfriend and our nanny went out to a bar, took our baby son with them. They went to a bar on Hollywood Boulevard. They picked up a couple of guys in this bar, brought them back to our house, slept with them in our bed, and these guys wound up ripping them off. They took their wallets and their money, all their money and their passports. And that's what she was upset about. I, of course, was appalled that this could happen, that an innocent young girl from England could come in and be a nanny in America and get into a situation like that where my son could have either been kidnapped or killed easily. And so that was the end of nannies for us. And I took this girl. She had a brother who was had just come in on a ship from London that was in the harbor in San Diego. I put her in the car with all of her belongings, drove her down to her brother at the ship, and said, "Here, she's out of here." And so it was that memory of the really devastating experience that I had with this nanny that caused me to think that there was a terrifying situation in that material. A couple of the other women that we had come in to help us from time to time, who we never let stay with our son alone anymore, but who came in to help us. A couple of these other women had other problems too. I mean, with drugs, with unreliability. And then over the years, I started to hear horror stories from some of my friends who had young children as well, and we would all compare notes about the horrendous experiences we all had with nannies. And so that, when Joe Wazan came along with this story, which was originally a novel by Dan Greenberg called The Nanny, I thought, well, yeah, there is validity here for a horror film.
Well, there's an old adage in the film business that, you never work with children or with animals. And in fact, in The Guardian, you work with both. Can you talk a little bit about casting the babies and working with very young infants in the film?
Well, yeah, I mean, we looked at a lot of infants, a lot of young children, and of course the ones that we cast in the guy, you have to have more than one because you can't keep a baby on a set for a long time. So we were able to fortunately find a set of twins and to use them for the length of time that the union requirements indicated, and then we'd bring in the other baby and use this other child. Perhaps that's even discernible. Those people who can tell the difference between twins might see a difference in these kids. To me, it's virtually unrecognizable, but I was surprised how many parents of newborn children are willing to have their kids be used in a film, because it can't be a very pleasant experience for the baby who doesn't know what the hell's going on. And, there's all these people standing around and moving around with lights and various, weird cameras and things. And so obviously it can't be very pleasant for a child, but I tried to keep it, a good experience for the children as well, not keep them in front of the cameras too long. A shot just went by that in this dream sequence of Dwyer Brown's, where he falls asleep at his drawing board and has visions of what is to come in this story or what could happen. I was very influenced at that time by the work of a video artist by the name of Bill Viola, whose work still interests me a lot. And so this dream sequence owes a lot to the kind of dreamscape videos that Bill Viola makes. I mean, there's nothing literally from that, but I was watching Bill Viola's videos as I continue to this day to watch, and it helped me a great deal in envisioning, a dream sequence.
Guardian has a great visual look to it. It's got that kind of classic haunted house feel. And you've worked with some of the great modern cinematographers. You worked with Owen Roizman on The French Connection. You worked with Robbie Mueller on To Live and Die in L.A. John Alonzo shot The Guardian. He also shot Chinatown, Norma Ray, Scarface, some of our most amazing modern movies. Can you talk about working with Alonzo on the movie?
John's a wonderful man and, extremely versatile. He and I started together doing documentaries at the David L. Wolper Company. He was a camera operator, and I was writing, producing, and directing documentaries for Wolper. And our paths crossed then, and we worked together a lot in those days, back in the middle and late 60s. And I always wanted to find a film to do with John, and he was either always busy or I was, shooting in another part of the country, and we kept in touch, and I got very lucky that when I decided to do The Guardian, John was available. And it was a sheer joy working with him. He's an absolutely wonderful and accomplished cinematographer who makes it all look easy. He was trained by the great James Wong Howe. And so he learned from Howe how to bring about very often complicated effects, but achieving them very simply. And just a pleasure to work with him on this. He contributed a lot to it visually, I feel.
Now, you mentioned your early work in documentaries. Some people may not realize you directed some of the landmark documentaries of the 1960s, like The People versus Paul Crump, The Thin Blue Line, some really amazing, groundbreaking work. And before that, you had worked in live television. Can you talk about how your early career in live TV and documentaries led into your feature film career as a director?
Well, when I was doing live television, I was a teenager and in my early 20s. And live television technique has nothing whatsoever to do with film. They just don't cross at all, other than from time to time you're working with actors, and you're always working with a crew. And so what happens, what I learned from doing live television was how to deal with actors and how to deal with crews, but that's all. The techniques are completely different. I started doing documentaries quite by chance because I wanted to tell the story of a young man who was a black man in Chicago, where I worked, who was on death row. And I set out to do a documentary to save this man's life, which the documentary eventually accomplished. And that's what got me into filmmaking. The film won a number of prizes. It won a number of awards for documentary, and that brought about the offer to do documentaries for David L. Wolper in Hollywood. And it wasn't until I got to work for Wolper that I ever did anything extensively with film, before I did anything on film, before I did this documentary, The People versus Paul Crump, I had directed about 2,000 live television shows. And believe me, that when I set out to do my first work on film in this documentary, I had no idea what to do with the camera, or no idea of the possibilities of editing, because at that time, in my youth, or before that time, I was only interested in movies, not films, not film as art, but film as entertainment. And so I was never really conscious of film technique. And I never had any lessons. I never went to film school. I sort of learned on the job. And my consciousness of film technique came about when, quite by accident, I saw Citizen Kane as a young man directing live television. And everything I know about film technique comes from watching Citizen Kane.
Now, you're not the only major director who's talked about Kane as the kind of a wellspring from which, creativity, has flowed. Bogdanovich and so many directors on down the line have talked about Kane as watching it as a seminal moment in their life. Why do you think that is? Is it just that it's such a great film, or is there something about Wells' approach to the subject matter, about when he was doing it?
Citizen Kane is a quarry for filmmakers, in the way that James Joyce's Ulysses is a quarry for writers. It's much more appreciated by people in the so-called industry, or people who do work in film, than it is by audiences. I mean, Citizen Kane will win all of these awards as the greatest movie ever made, but there are not a lot of people who have seen it. And without television, and the reruns it's had on television, people would not have seen it at all. But it is out there as a quarry for filmmakers, in the sense that you can look at it and there is everything you need to know about lighting, composition, editing, performance, and it's all put together in a highly original mix. And so as a young person growing up interested in becoming a filmmaker, I would say that all you need to do is look at Citizen Kane, and that's lesson enough. You can see how it's accomplished at the very highest level.
Well, do you think it's a little frightening that the greatest film made to this point was made 60 years ago? Do you think young filmmakers today aren't ambitious enough in terms of tackling something, of aiming higher than Citizen Kane?
Well, I feel that the whole notion of film as art has basically disappeared from American film. I think, the young generation of prominent filmmakers are mostly people who came up through commercials, through MTV videos, and through television. And it's rare to find any of them that have a real background in the classics. There are some exceptions to that, like David Fincher, who I believe is an absolutely brilliant director who is versed in the classics. And I think it shows in his work. But for the most part, the young filmmakers today are creating their own classics. They're creating their own world, and it owes very little to the past of American cinema. It owes much more to work that they themselves have done in music videos and MTV and commercial work.
Well, it's kind of ironic, because the 70s and the 80s saw the rise of, what's been called the film school generation. A lot of filmmakers whose experience was coming out of film school, and yet their films were not art films. They didn't seem to be aiming for Wells or Ford or for Hawks, the directors you'd think they would be aiming to beat. That they've made much more mainstream commercial films, and I think that continues right now.
I don't think that it's necessary to emulate your influences in any way. I think all that is important about these influences is how they affect you and provoke you and inspire you. But I never was able to emulate Citizen Kane, or to even, to this day, I haven't even approached it in terms of making something as complex, as original, or as lasting. I still bring to the work that I do the bread and the bone response that I had as a young person watching movies, not films, you know. And I still enjoy seeing movies. I get a little scared when I hear that something carries the weight of being a so-called art film. I get a little terrified that I'm liable to smell art all over the place, because I think that, for me, the very best films ever made involve one ingredient, and that is storytelling. That's what hooks audiences, not technique, not visual or verbal genius, but storytelling. Sometimes those qualities intersect. Sometimes a very entertaining, wonderfully told story is, also aspires to be something more than that, and occasionally achieves it, like Paths of Glory and All About Eve and The Treasure of Sierra Madre, which is Treasure of Sierra Madre and White Heat are marvelous action films that also aspire to something that reveals human nature to us in ways that we might not otherwise be ready to accept if they were more serious works.
Now, you've talked about how music is critical to all of your films. Thinking of a Tangerine Dream score for Sorcerer, or the great Don Ellis score for French Connection. And Jack Hughes did an amazing score for The Guardian. How did you choose working with Hughes, and how was it creatively?
Jack Hughes, when I met him, had this rock band called Wang Chung, which consisted of himself and one other person, a guy named Nick Feldman. And they made all of that music. They achieved all of those sounds, just the two of them. Originally, I think they worked with a drummer. But Jack Hughes and Wang Chung was the sound I chose for To Live and Die in L.A. And I thought he did a great job with that soundtrack, and he was wonderful to work with. Jack Hughes's influences are not at all from the world of rock and roll. His influences are from classical music. And in the case of the Guardian score, he was much more interested in, as was I, the music of Shostakovich, Dmitri Shostakovich, the great early 20th century Russian composer. And the Guardian score is based on the works of Shostakovich, for whom Jack and I share a common admiration. This is another sequence inspired by Bill Viola's videos that I'm looking at now on the screen, which are really, I highly recommend them because they deal with the dream state and are very effective in conveying the dream state and how I think people dream.
Now, the production designer for The Guardian was Greg Fonseca, who also did Nightmare on Elm Street and several other horror films. And working with him, you created a great sense of this malevolent forest atmosphere, the environment outside of the safety of the house, the demon tree with faces trapped within it. Can you talk about working with Fonseca and how you mapped out the feel of the film?
Greg Fonseca brought a great deal to The Guardian, I think. It was his idea to do the house as a very contemporary house, not as an old dark house, not as a place where it was obvious that a horrific story could take place. And that was his idea, not mine. And I thought it was very original, a really terrific notion, to do this in a contemporary house that had no particular frightening characteristics about it. If you look at horror films that are set in a house, the qualities of the house play an important part, and they're clearly obvious settings for some dark and mysterious deeds. For example, the modern version of The Haunting, where they're attempting to scare you just by showing you the exterior and then the interior of the house. It was Greg Fonseca's idea that we do a house in the San Fernando Valley that was in no way suggestive of a house of horrors, that was rather ordinary, that was not really distinctive, but whose only distinguishing characteristic would be the fact that it was of contemporary design. And I thought that was an absolutely wonderful idea on his part, because it went along with my notion of showing this kind of horror in the most prosaic of settings.
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes The Guardian a great Los Angeles film, and in some ways I think it's almost a companion piece to Live and Die in L.A., which you had made 4 or 5 years earlier, because it really captures the sense of canyon life in Los Angeles, of people who come to L.A. from another town who suddenly find themselves flush with cash and cut off from other people, living in these beautiful homes surrounded by sort of endless woods where nobody's going to hear you scream.
Yeah, there is that factor as well. I must say that I had a wonderful time making this film, and I really still like it. And of course, it was not a successful film. It led me to realize that I had no idea, what was going to be a success any more when I did The Exorcist or The French Connection. I had no thought that either of those films would become, as they did, kind of cultural events, Academy Award nominations, Academy Awards. In my opinion, The Guardian is as good as the best work that I've done. But that's only my opinion. It has nothing to do with public taste. But I have a great fondness for this film because as a filmmaker, everything you do reflects a certain time in your life when you felt a certain way about things, and how much of your vision you were able to get on film and to achieve. And as far as I'm concerned, I achieved everything that I was thinking about with this film at that time. Perhaps my aspirations were not exceptionally high. I don't know. In my view, they were high. To me, The Guardian is an attempt to do a grim fairy tale in a contemporary setting. And that, to me, was always a very original idea. And as I look at the film now, as we're talking about this film, and as I look at it, and as I see these people, if I could do it all over again, I wouldn't change anything today. I wouldn't recast it. I wouldn't try to get stars in it. I love these people, and I believe them.
Well, what you said about making a modern fairy tale actually reminds me of a terrific little film which very few people saw, called Freeway, directed by Matthew Bright, with Reese Witherspoon and Kiefer Sutherland, which takes the Little Red Riding Hood myth and makes it very contemporary. And I think that's a film that a lot of people should try and check out because it was so inventive.
Don't Look Now is another film that really has, in its time, I guess it was the late 60s, had a very strong contemporary feeling of the fairy tale about it. And there isn't a lot of work like that falls into that category. I was thinking, as I say, much more in terms of the grim fairy tales, which in their way are horrific, than any kind of horror films, such as Argento. I would love to someday be able to make a film as good as any of the classic Argento horror films. And as I say, I like them because they're pure and simple entertainment. I don't believe that films are here necessarily to express philosophies or to express social conditions or to make an audience necessarily think beyond the routine of their everyday lives. Those are qualities that are admirable. But if a film can be purely entertaining and just give you 2 hours or less of escape, I think there's nothing wrong with that either.
Well, you just mentioned another great film and great director, Don't Look Now, directed by Nicholas Roeg, who was a really important filmmaker in the 1970s, even through the early 80s, and he's still working, and I think he's still making really interesting movies, but he seems to have been overlooked or underrated in the past 5-10 years. Can you talk a little bit about how difficult it is to maintain a career as a filmmaker, to maintain longevity, especially when you may make a film that causes an enormous impact 10 or 15 years earlier, living up to expectations, continuing to do good work in a business that really is based on what is your next film, what is your latest hit.
You have to be very ambitious. You have to have, great strength in order to continue as a filmmaker when you're not necessarily turning out hit after hit, as Steven Spielberg does, and very well. But what you must have is a belief in yourself and a love for the work. And that's how you continue. I mean, when you mention someone like Nicholas Roeg or other directors who, let's say, do not have continual box office successes, what they have is a great love of cinema, and their successes are measured by how much they have been able to achieve their visions, which are highly unique and original. And that's, sort of the way I think of myself. It's wonderful to have a huge box office success every time out, but there's no way to predict that that's going to happen or to make that happen. Every time you think you have the formula, you find out that the formula has changed and someone else has it. It's pretty clear that a film like Star Wars in 1977 changed the formula for everybody. And so much of the work that has come out since Star Wars is simply emulative of Star Wars. Just as there were a lot of films that to this day try to emulate The Exorcist. I don't. I feel that The Guardian, for example, is as far away from The Exorcist as you can get. Because what I tried to do with The Exorcist was stone realism, a realistic film about inexplicable events. But a realistic film is the operative phrase. The Guardian, while I'm unable to direct anything that doesn't, let's say, try to have a realistic foundation, The Guardian is much more surrealistic. It is much more heightened realism than what you see if you look at The Exorcist. And yes, there are sort of what could be considered supernatural events in The Exorcist, but they're presented as realistically as possible and left for the audience to decide whether this is mass hysteria or what. But I made The Exorcist thinking about characters who lived in a real house on a real street in a real little town, and I stuck to that, throughout. And in fact, the most frightening scene to most people in The Exorcist is the most realistic scene, and that's the arteriogram, where they're trying to determine whether the little girl has brain dysfunction. That section of The Exorcist was used as a training film at NYU Medical Center for the performance of arteriograms. The Guardian, on the other hand, which I say I'm extremely fond of, is a film that deals with, at the least, heightened realism or surrealism. And again, while it is impossible to avoid realism in anything that I do, that's not what I'm going for here. I'm going much more for the myth set in the contemporary world.
Well, the scene we just watched here of Jenny Seagrove, her naked body caressed by the limbs of the spirit tree, almost has a feeling of a Cocteau movie. It almost feels like Beauty and the Beast or Orpheus.
Those were films that I loved after I started to watch serious films, and that's basically disappeared, from the world. Those kind of really surrealistic visions, like the films of Cocteau. Orpheus is a great movie with wonderful surrealistic imagery, as is The Blood of a Poet. And yeah, I guess I was unconsciously influenced by works like that in The Guardian as well. But basically, to a great extent, I think there is a lot of originality to it. In spite of everything, I don't necessarily see those influences, although they were always there. As you said earlier, I'm an admirer of Dario Argento, but I don't see any of that in this film, because while I admire that stuff, I'm not interested in emulating it.
Now, in the scene we're watching right now, Brad Hall is being menaced by live wolves outside his house. Guardian uses both live animals and animatronic wolf heads for the scenes at the Spirit Tree. Can you talk a little bit about working with the animal wranglers and also about working with the special effects company that did the animatronic wolf heads?
Well, of course, there was no computer-generated images in The Guardian. I mean, they didn't exist at that time. Everything that we did, we had to bring about mechanically. The opticals that are in The Guardian are all basically done in the camera, and they're done through things like match dissolves. But for the most part, everything, all of the effects in The Guardian are achieved mechanically, either with, as you point out, real wolves or real animals or animatronics. For example, the arms of the tree were achieved by mechanical special effects, a man named Phil Corey. And some of the wolf heads, which are used very sparingly in the film, were done by Matthew Mungle, who's a very fine makeup artist who works with animatronic creatures as well. But there is no, outside of makeup and special effects, all of the effects were done mechanically, as they were in The Exorcist. When you see the bed go off the ground in The Exorcist, or when you see the tree squeezing the life out of characters or caressing the Jenny Seagrove character in The Guardian, that's happening. We were able to achieve that with mechanical effects. And I love working with mechanical effects. It's too easy to work with CGI. CGI has made it possible to do anything and to do everything. And I think that that's often a weakness. There are films out today that purport to be horror films where the CGI is so dominant that it takes over from the characters and the story. When you're only able to call upon certain mechanical effects, you're going to do a lot less, because you can only go so far with mechanical effects, and the rest you have to leave to the audience's imagination. With computer-generated imagery, you can do everything, and therefore nothing is left to the imagination. And films cost infinitely more, because so many of this generation's filmmakers are hung up on what is possible with CGI. And they have the money. The studios have the money to put everything that a filmmaker can come up with on the screen. And before that, we had to find ways to devise what I would say are a small percentage of what we imagined. What people like Val Lewton or the great horror directors of the 40s and 50s imagined, they could hardly achieve at all. And so they called upon the audience's imagination to fill in things from shadows and from suggestive sound. And I tried to do a lot of that with The Guardian.
You shouldn't have followed me.
And the sequence you're looking at now in the cellar is done mostly with suggestive sounds. It's mostly a sound experience. There's almost no dialogue in this sequence, and it's only the effect on Brad Hall's character here mostly comes from what he and what the audience hears and not what they see.
Well, the use of CGI brings up another kind of troubling question. I know that George Lucas went back to Star Wars, and he, quote unquote, fixed some of the effects that he said he wasn't happy with. And I've heard Bob Skotak, who's an Oscar-winning special effects expert, say that he'd love to go back and fix War of the Worlds, which is one of his favorite films, and make the effects of the alien spacecraft, remove some of the blue screen lines around them. How do you feel about filmmakers going back in, whether it's their own film or somebody else's, and trying to update older movies using today's computer effects?
Oh, there's nothing wrong with it if you're able to do that. I wouldn't change anything about The Guardian or The Exorcist, which was again all mechanical effects. Clearly, all the effects in both of those films can be done better today with computer-generated images. But I wouldn't do it because I think they work well enough. I believe everything I see in this stuff, and in some of the really classic or great horror films that I've ever seen, where the effects were achieved mechanically, I think they work. I don't know why you'd want to go back. I mean, it's an interesting conceit, that George Lucas would want to go back and change what was at the time the most successful film of all time, Star Wars, with all of its flaws. I mean, part of the reason a film succeeds is because of its flaws. It's like scars in fine leather, You never know quite what the audience is really reacting to. The audience knows that none of this stuff is real. The audience isn't stupid. They know they're watching a movie. And they know that they're going to be called upon to use their imagination. And they like that. And audiences sometimes enjoy films where the mechanical effects are not that well achieved. They find an enjoyment in it. You look at something like the early versions of Frankenstein and the Wolfman, and by today's standards, they're ludicrous and laughable because audiences today know that those effects were cheap and they were, all that the filmmakers were capable of at that time, and by today's standards, it just isn't enough. And yet, those films still work and they still deliver in their primitiveness. I mean, it's like primitive art in a way. Haitian art, the Haitian street paintings that were done by artists who never saw a famous painting, but were just painting out of their imaginations, and their effects are simple and primitive. This is highly enjoyable stuff. And so, I mean, if I was able to go back and do all of these effects in The Guardian over again, I wouldn't do it.
People may know that it's a film on subconscious level, and yet you've made movies that have created such a sense of realism of the moment that people can't escape into that safety of saying it's just a film. I mean, we showed The Exorcist recently, and you'd think here's a film that has been seen so many times, and yet halfway through the film, I walked into the lobby of the theater and there were 3 or 4 people sitting there huddled up because they were so affected by the movie. And I remember your wife came in and she was, kind of delighted by the fact that here was this movie, 25 years old, that people still could not, resist. It was still so troubling to them.
I think that's the power of the story. I think it's, The Exorcist is a timeless story about inexplicable things. The Exorcist is very fortunate in its cast, in that the cast became inseparable from their roles. When you look at The Exorcist, you believe that Max von Sydow is a priest, that Jason Miller is a priest, that Ellen Burstyn is a troubled mother, that Linda Blair is a possessed child. You believe every character that parades across the screen, and that's why I think the work continues to live. It's not dated. The fashions, of course, are dated. Some hairstyles are dated, but not in a way that's troubling to an audience or gets in the way of the timelessness of the story. I mean, that's why films last and live, when the characters become inseparable from the actors who are playing them.
I called everyone on the list I could find. People have been very cooperative. Apparently it's happened before. I am sure it's her. You have a young child, don't you? A little boy?
Yes, but this is all too hard for me to accept. I
Who
can't...
takes care of it?
I understand how you
No,
feel, but...
you don't. I hope you never do.
You directed The Guardian about 2 years after you directed a really fascinating film called Rampage, which wasn't released at the time. It wasn't released until several years later. And I know that that must have been a frustrating experience for you to have made a film that was really dark, really intense, a really fascinating movie, and yet to not have it see the light of day until in fact after The Guardian came out. Was any of that something that affected you making The Guardian?
The Rampage was made for the De Laurentiis company, and then they went out of business before they were ever able to release the film. And the De Laurentiis company went bankrupt, and so the film was caught up in the bankruptcy. And Miramax, the Weinstein brothers, were always big fans of Rampage, and they wanted to release it and get it out of bankruptcy, and it took a couple of years to achieve that. And I think it was fortunate, because in that time I was able to rethink the picture and rethink my feelings about it, and I re-edited the film before it finally appeared under the Miramax label. I re-edited the film, and I think, that the film reflected my deeper feelings then and now about that subject matter of capital punishment. So I think it was fortunate and prophetic that the film was not originally released in the way I had intended it, because the final version, the one that exists now, is the one I re-edited for Miramax, is one that I feel much closer to and much more able to stand behind.
Now, talking about different versions, there was apparently a different version of The Guardian that was screened on cable television, if I'm not wrong, that was a different edit, had a different rhythm or slightly different scenes. Is that true? And what was the...
No, I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
I've never heard of that. I'm completely unaware of it, if it was, seriously.
Okay,
I don't remember doing that at all, or having that done. No, I have no recollection of that whatever.
Yeah, I had read in some reference that there might have been a slightly different version on cable TV, and this is the only version that I've ever seen, which was the theatrical release.
Me too. I mean, I have no knowledge of what you're talking about at all, Dennis.
Okay.
I don't know how you'd change this. I mean, I don't know what you would do with it to make it any different. Now, there are a lot of vagaries that occur at distribution companies and at networks, but if that took place, I mean, generally, you would know of something like that, and I'm not aware of it. I mean, I've had people tell me they've seen different versions of The Exorcist. There are none. There's only that. I mean, when we put The Exorcist on commercial television, on CBS, I made some changes in the film. I dubbed some of the lines, which amounts to perhaps less than a minute of the picture. But that isn't what people are talking about. People have told me that they saw different versions of The Exorcist in theaters, and I know that that's not the case.
This brings up another subject that you have talked about a number of times in conversations, where you said that you look forward to the day when digital projection takes over, because then you won't have to worry about the quality of prints, the quality of projection. There's a kind of legendary story surrounding the release of The Exorcist, where you literally went out with a team to each of the theaters that was doing the first run of the film and made sure that they upgraded their projection, their screen. How do you feel about digital projection technology coming in?
Well, I think that digital projection will eliminate all of the problems that we as filmmakers have with prints. Prints deteriorate. Every time you run a 35 millimeter print of a picture, it gets scratched up. Sometimes it gets torn. It gets dirty. And very often films that we see in the theaters, first run films, have deteriorated from the original vision. I happen to love the video medium and DVD and Laserdisc, because the version that you get at home is better than any print that exists. I mean, this print that we're watching of The Guardian is much clearer, cleaner, much more pristine as a print than anything that ever ran in a theater. It's been cleaned up. You know, all of the scratches and marks have been removed from it, and the audience is watching a kind of pure version of it, the way the director of photography and the director intended them to see it. If you watch this film in a theater, well, the colors fade within a year. You're not watching true color, and you're watching something that is. It's like the equivalent of seeing a painting in a museum that someone has scarred, you know, or thrown acid at, or in one way or another tried to destroy. That's what prints are. They're a very fragile and finite medium. Now, I grant you that it is the medium that we call home, you know, but there is better technology around today. And so why not use it to preserve the filmmaker's true vision? And that's why I will not in any way miss 35 millimeter, you know, as a way of presenting a vision to an audience. I think that the techniques will remain the same. The idea of montage and composition will always be reflective of 35 millimeter technology, but the means of conveying that to an audience much better accomplished by contemporary means such as digital technology.
Well, people have talked about threats to theatrical exhibition over the years. In the 50s, it was TV that was going to kill films. Then in the 70s, they talked about VCRs. And now recently, they've been talking about the advent of things like DVD or downloading films over the net, which they're still perfecting, but they're going to get to probably in the next couple of years. Do you think we're going to reach a point where major commercial filmmakers, at the height of their powers, are going to be making films that are just going to go straight to DVD, straight to downloading over the internet, like they're talking about now with major music groups, major bands, downloading them to a re-recordable CD at your home?
I think there's no doubt that films will be made in the very near future directly to DVD technology. Absolutely. And why not? It's a better delivery system. In the same way that we don't release recordings anymore that are all scratched up or that have glitches in them, the technology is able to remove all that. In the old days of wire recording and tape recording, and then the subsequent release on acetate or wax, or 78 RPM, 33 1/3 RPM, and even 45 RPM. On those systems, the audience was hearing all sorts of technical imperfections, like needle scratch and glitches and deterioration that resulted from constant replaying. Today, all of that is gone with digital sound. And I'm a great believer that the digital technology has improved all of these delivery systems immeasurably.
Do you think you're losing something, though, by not having those little imperfections, those little glitches, the hiss and the crackle and the pop every now and then of the record needle bouncing over the grooves?
No, I don't think you're losing anything. I don't think that Beethoven or Mozart or Chopin or Shostakovich or Bach wrote anything and built in the scratches and the glitches. They didn't even know about recording. The great music that was written for audiences to hear in as pristine an atmosphere as possible. That's why concert halls were built to take out imperfection, so that an audience could hear a composition as the composer intended it. But from the very beginnings of movies, the delivery systems had built-in problems. They were not delivering the films as the filmmakers intended them. They were delivering them with dirt and noise and scratches and pops and all sorts of things that I always found very distracting, that always became something that you had to overcome in order to get into the film.
rid of all this stuff.
Something's wrong with him. I feel something's wrong.
How long has he been like this?
About 3 hours.
He hasn't opened his eyes at all.
Is his breathing normal?
Oh, yes, fine.
Oh, thank God.
Has he eaten anything?
Would you ever consider doing another supernatural or horror project if the script were right?
I would certainly consider doing another supernatural or horror film if it appealed to me on some personal or emotional level, as The Guardian did. I explained earlier, when we were talking about how The Guardian brought back all sorts of memories of the horrific experiences that I had with nannies when my son was newly born. And so it really touched a chord in me. I've been offered a lot of horror films since, and I haven't really chosen to do any, either before or since. It isn't that I haven't seen some that I've liked, but I've never seen any either in script form or in novel form that would appeal to me. I would have no interest, for example, in doing at this time in doing a Stephen King book, for example. Although for what they are, they're I guess enjoyable.
Now, you've worked in so many different genres. You've done classic crime films like The French Connection and To Live and Die in L.A. You've done brilliant adaptations of stage material like The Boys in the Band and The Birthday Party. You've done epic jungle adventure like Sorcerer. Is there any one genre or form of storytelling that really attracts you or gets you excited?
No, there is no one form or genre, Dennis. What attracts me, I guess the theme that constantly pulls me in whatever form is the thin line between good and evil, and how otherwise decent people very often have indecent or imperfect thoughts and actions. So that's really what attracts me, the thin line between good and evil. That can take place in any number of genres, of course.
Now, you did a brilliant film for television about a year and a half ago called 12 Angry Men. Amazing cast, amazing direction.
12 Angry Men was something I was interested in doing because it's a classic script. I don't think of it as a remake any more than any production of Hamlet or Death of a Salesman or View from the Bridge or Streetcar Named Desire is a remake. It's a new version, a new vision of a classic work. 12 Angry Men is such a work. And again, it plays right into the theme that I mentioned to you that is of the strongest interest to me, and that is the thin line between good and evil, and how very often good people can do very bad things. And it happens to be an absolutely wonderful script. In its way, it's a perfect script with 12 fully realized characters.
Now, the thin line between good and evil is a theme I think that recurs in the film you're working on now. You're in post-production on The Rules of Engagement with Tommy Lee Jones and Samuel L. Jackson. Can you talk a little bit about this film? It hasn't come out yet, but it's something you're working on right now. Can you talk a little bit about how you got involved with the project?
Well, Rules of Engagement is really, it was an original script by the man who was at one time the Secretary of the Navy, Jim Webb, under Ronald Reagan and George Bush. And he resigned after about 8 months as Secretary of the Navy because of disagreements with the Reagan administration. He was a classmate of Oliver North's at the Naval Academy and Senator John McCain and Bud McFarland, who was a national security advisor. And Jim Webb wrote Rules of Engagement as an original screenplay that had to do with his experiences, his early experiences in Vietnam and then since Vietnam. He worked on that script for about 10 years and was never able to bring about a version that could get made. Dick Zanuck, the producer, and I got the project a couple of years ago, reworked it with a new writer named Steve Gagan. We took what is essentially Jim Webb's theme, characters, and story, and it is really about the morality of war. Is there such a thing as a moral compass in war? And again, it deals with why good people very often do bad things. But it's I think, a very highly intense piece of work about the contemporary military. Not only its mindset, but its performance, and how the military throughout time has been severely restricted and condemned by the civilian forces that control it.
We're looking at the climax here of The Guardian, which I think has some great editing between action in different locations. Can you talk about the process of winnowing down and focusing the material? Do you usually start with a much longer cut? Do you usually start with a cut that's very close to what the finished film will be?
Often I start with a cut that's very close to what the finished film will be. But editing is a process that I love most about filmmaking, because the language of film is montage, and montage is editing. The way you juxtapose one image with another is the way in which these very highly disparate elements, these different shots, are able to come together or not. And I find, the editing process is the most creative part of filmmaking, because all of the pressures of shooting, all of the pressures of dealing with time and weather and actors' problems, all of those things disappear, and suddenly you're left alone with the raw film to make something that very often takes on a completely different life from what had been shot or what was originally intended.
Well, you've got that great shot of Jenny Seagrove flying through the trees. I think really kind of captures her kind of, wild, dark spirit. How was that done?
Well, we got a lot of strong guys and picked her up and threw her. She's, of course, rigged in a harness. And there was no such thing as wire removal then. As you have now, you can remove wires with computer graphics. We had to light that sequence so you couldn't see wires. Same with the levitation in The Exorcist. There was no way to remove the wires. We had to design it so that the wires wouldn't be lit. I had this image of this woman flying through the forest, which is very operatic, that I always wanted to do. It's reminiscent. A lot of the effects are reminiscent of certain stagings of Wagner operas that I'd seen over the years, which are, again, examined under the clear light of day. They're sort of ludicrous, but while you're in the theater watching and listening to the opera unfold, you get totally caught up in it.
I was just going to ask you about the design of the spirit tree.
The spirit tree is very influenced by the etchings of Gustave Doré, who illustrated a lot of the classic fairy tales. He illustrated Dante's Inferno in a very famous edition. So it's influenced by that, and it also is based on my own and Greg Fonseca's concept of what such a natural phenomenon might look like. And because The Guardian was a very low-budget film, it I'm sure reflects that in some ways. As I've said, I would not go back and change it to this day if I could get a better version of it with computer-generated imagery. I think for what it is, it works very well. A film usually finds itself in the cutting room, and very often it loses itself as well, I'm sure. I've heard stories of films that, seemed brilliant at the time they were shot, and then when they came out, they weren't so brilliant. But it is the most challenging aspect of filmmaking, and the one that most closely resembles composition. Composition is where a piece of music is created, and the editing room is where film is created. Shooting of a film, the photography, the performance, all that can be viewed as nothing more than the raw materials for editing. And that is how I view them.
Well, some of the great directors were editors first, like Don Siegel,
David Lean. Sure.
Richard Fleischer, I think, started out editing in the late 30s, early 40s. So I think it's something not a lot of people realize is just how critical editing is to the filmmaker's creative POV.
Yeah, and it is the part of filmmaking that I most enjoy. And it's, as I say, it's where they either come together or they don't. But you can find things, combinations of things that work in a cutting room that you had no idea were going to work when you were shooting the film.
Now, you've actually directed a major opera production, haven't you?
I directed Alban Berg's Wozzeck in Florence, Italy, a year ago, conducted by Zubin Mehta. It was a great experience. I directed what is perhaps the most important contemporary opera, which is Alban Berg's Wozzeck, and I'm going to do more operas. I've committed to do 3 now for the Los Angeles Opera Company with Placido Domingo.
Now, there's several other great modern filmmakers who've directed operas as well. Like Herzog, I know, has done a couple, and Argento, who we've mentioned before. What is it about opera that attracts the kind of creative filmmaking POV?
The ability to try and find a visual equivalent of great music. And in my case, to do a version of that music that does not do any injustices to the music itself. I view my role as a director in the way that the Surgeon's Credo is stated. The Surgeon's Credo is first, do no harm. And so when I undertook to direct an opera, that was my credo, that was my motto. First, do no harm. In other words, don't try and take this great classic work and just put my imprint all over it. Try and reflect what I felt the composer intended. And that's what I think is the work of a filmmaker or director. If you've written the script, as I wrote a great deal of The Guardian, you try to be as true to the vision of the writer as you possibly can. In The Exorcist, I felt that I was totally faithful to the vision of the writer. And he was my first and most important audience, the writer. I wanted him to feel that particular work now being envisioned on the screen was a strong and true reflection of his novel. That is what I think is the most important role of a director.
There's some tremendous body makeup here on Jenny Seagrove in the scene we're watching. Was it difficult to get just the right combination of darkness and shadow? It's very revealing, and yet also it's really suggestive. It leaves a lot to the imagination. Did you guys have to work with that a lot?
Well, the biggest problem with doing that was beating people off who wanted to do it. I wanted to do the body makeup myself, but since I wasn't as talented as Matthew Mungle, he got to do it. But it was the most desirable job on the film, doing Jenny's body makeup. She's an absolutely delightful person and a terrific actress.
And she gives a great performance because the fact that she's British and she is so immensely likable makes you want to trust her. You know, it's like Jenny Agutter,
Yeah.
who had a similar quality, you know, in the 70s and early 80s. And of course, that plays against her kind of demonic nature.
Yes. She was a pleasure to work with and up for everything. I mean, she has this real kind of British nature, and so she's able to make a lot of things that seem really ludicrous come off as plausible because of her training in the classics.
And again, we're looking at some, by today's standards, very low-tech effects here. We're looking at the animatronic tree wrapping around Dwyer Brown's leg, but I think it's a great effect. How hard was it to work with these animatronic trees?
Well, they were well designed, I think, to work as well as they do. And I think if they had been designed to work any better, I don't necessarily feel that the film would have been better. I think, you know, to me, a part of the charm of this film is the sort of very simple, almost primitive effects in it.
Did you have any experience with the MPAA over censorship or different edit of the film?
No, the MPAA wasn't troubled by any of this. They saw it as a fairy tale, and they, you know, it got an R rating, which it should have got an R rating, and it did. But there weren't any cuts that I can recall being made for rating purposes. Nor were there any cuts made by the ratings board on The Exorcist. None. The Exorcist got an R rating with no cuts as well. It was a very different ratings board than it is now. You know, for some reason, you know, the ratings board responds more to criticism than it did in its earlier incarnation.
Yeah, it seems like the MPAA and Jack Valenti are really embattled these days. A lot of people saying that we should redefine what the rating system is. We should come up with new ratings that better reflect the films. What's your personal take on that?
I have a minority opinion. I believe that the rating system works as well as it could or should. And because I remember when they didn't have a rating system, and what you had was every local little small town or big city would get a film that had, let's say, questionable sexual or violent material in it, and every city would recut the picture. I remember growing up in Chicago, you could not even play a film there that had anything to do with political corruption, because it was an insult to the mayor of Chicago at that time. And horror films and films that dealt with violence were very often completely re-edited in every town in which they played. And because of the rating system, you don't have that now. The public basically does trust the ratings, and so the films are left alone, which is as it should be.
Well, we're looking at the last shot here, the beautiful dolly backwards as we see the owl sitting in the tree turning its head, which is very stylized. It's a wonderful way to end the film.
Dennis, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope that the audience has gotten some enjoyment from seeing this film today in this form, and I'm grateful to you and to Anchor Bay, especially Bill Lustig.
I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your time, your thoughts about the making of The Guardian and filmmaking, all the tremendous American movies that you've made.